Well, our next speaker has another association with Howard Weeder, somewhat different, is Dr. Christian Onof, and he is Reader in Stochastic Environmental Systems at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Imperial College in London. And I understand he came from France to be a PhD student of Professor Weeder and carried on in the grand tradition of stochastical modeling. So anyway, I'd like to welcome you and carry on. And as we approach 15 minutes, the hockey stick will come out and attack you. So so you advance with this, retreat with this, and you can point with that.
Yeah, I was hoping that John wasn't into hockey, but obviously he is, so yeah. Don't get your hopes up. This is probably the only really nice picture in the presentation, so enjoy it for a couple of minutes. So that's me, the top there, and then there is a few PhD students, David Cross, then Dr. Kim from the University of Seoul in South Korea, and a postdoc, Li Pen Wang, who've contributed to some of the work that I'm going to show. I'll talk about the motivation for stochastic point rainfall modeling. In a sense, some of it's been covered already by Richard, but slightly different approach here. I just have one slide on different approaches to rainfall modeling, then focus on the so-called Poisson cluster approach. I'm going to bore you there with about 3 slides giving you kind of the outline of the model, but don't worry, no equations, I think. And then I'll say in what sense some of the work that Howard initiated in the late 90s and the early 2000s addresses some of the challenges of these of getting a good stochastic rainfall model. Then talk about some recent and contemporary work, so some work that was parallel to that work that we were doing, then work since that funding that Howard obtained, and just one slide on looking at the future at the end. So motivation, one of the big motivations for doing stochastic rainfall modeling, that's something that I heard from Howard quite often when I started doing my PhD, is that the current approach to doing hydrological design is limited, is rather flawed, because in effect what you're trying to do is get an estimate of an N-year flood. And to do that, well, you probably don't have enough flow data available. You probably have more rainfall data available, and you can regionalize the rainfall. You can do some extreme value distribution, fits to rainfall data, regionalize that. So this is done typically in a lot of the developed countries. You have, for the whole country, you have estimates of the, say, 100-year rainfall. That would give you an estimate of a P-year rainfall. P, however, and N are not necessarily the same. So what am I going to do with that rainfall? That P-year rainfall, what's done typically is to input it into a rainfall runoff model. We have to give the event that we're inputting, we have to give it a shape. So you can see the standard type of shape. This is going back to the flood studies report, similar in the flood estimation handbook in the UK. Have to give it a shape in time, which is probably not like anything you've ever seen in terms of rainfall events. So it's a very artificial shape. You put that into a rainfall runoff model, or into a hydraulic model, because my interest these days, I've moved rather towards urban hydrology, and you get estimates of flows or other outputs you might be interested in. So there's an issue of a mismatch of the return period of the rainfall and the return period of the flows. That can be addressed by using some scaling factors, but certainly we're never going to, with that kind of approach, never going to be able to cover the whole range of antecedent conditions that are likely to happen before any kind of extreme storms. Plus, the storm profile is unrealistic, which is probably going to be a problem, certainly for urban hydrologists, going down to sub-daily scales and sub-hourly scales, but even for rural hydrologists. So the idea here is to say, well, let's generate long series of rainfall in which we're going to have the whole process, the dry and then the wet periods, and let's input that into rainfall runoff models, and there we can do very long simulations, 10,000 years. We can get good estimates, say, of 100-year rainfalls. As Richard said, there are problems with these kind of models. So these models come under the big denomination, let's say, of weather generators, but here I'm just focusing on rainfall and focusing on single site. The usual problems about extremes, not reproducing extremes, and models are typically stationary, and there's a question of how you address the challenge of climate change. What kind of approaches are there to stochastic modeling? So this sort of interacts a bit with, or overlaps a bit with what Richard's been saying. I think he mentioned resampling methods. That's a way of doing stochastic modeling without really doing anything stochastic. So you're, in a sense, you're using observed storms from data sets which you think are appropriate, and you're sampling from these data sets. That can be useful, but you're never going to generate, well, I say never, but some people try to do that, but typically you will not generate extremes which are more extreme than anything you've already observed. So maybe that's a bit limited. Then you've got what you might call purely statistical models, and generalized linear models, what we just saw, are probably the broadest class, but you have these subclasses of Markov models, or you have also some generally regression models, where you identify relations between the rainfall and some geo-information, such as temperature or sea level pressure, etc. So climatological information plus geo-information. That's what Richard's talked about. He's talked about generalizing the models, so I will not go any further with that. Just to point out that that typically is useful to address the daily timescale, but if you want to go down to sub-daily, the correlation structure is going to require that you do something else. And there are, I think, there are lots of approaches, but I think there are two typical sort of paradigms, if you want, of how to approach that, which developed actually in parallel. One of them involves, so I describe them both as phenomenological as opposed to purely statistical. It's obviously still a statistical model, but we're trying to reproduce something that we observe about the rainfall process. So I don't want to use the word physical, but there are no physical equations, but phenomenological in the sense that, well, for the first group of people, although it may not be obvious, it is in fact the case that there are no typical scales at which the process is actually occurring, right? Everything is scaling. And so they have models which are very parsimonious, so that's very attractive. I'm not going to say more about this. I mean, I have used that kind of model in conjunction with other types of models. I'm going to focus on this approach here, where on the contrary, you do say that there are some typical scales at which things are happening. There's what you might call what meteorologists refer to as cells that you see spatially, but then here we're interpreting them in time at a location. So you'll have small events which perhaps overlap and which occur in clusters within storms. So the outline of that model is as follows. The idea is to use theory of point processes. So this is the statistical point process here. Storm arrivals, then you can add after the storm arrivals, you can have a process of cell arrivals, which is for each of the storms. And then for each of these arrivals of cells, you have a random amount and a random duration of rainfall. And then you add all these things together to get a Hayata graph. That's in continuous time. What you have available is data at a particular level of aggregation, so you can aggregate all that, and you can do the maths. So what's nice about these models is that you can get a lot of results analytically. You can do the maths if the distributions you choose are sufficiently simple to get properties of the aggregated process. So just to summarize that again, to look at how many random elements we have in this model, we have here typically 2 storms. They must be defined by storm duration. You must say what is the rate of arrival of the storm. If you have, say, a Poisson process of independent arrivals, you must then indicate how often cells arrive within the storm. And then each cell, you have this amount of rainfall that has a random intensity and a random duration. So you end up typically with something like 5 parameters if you use very simple distributions with 1 parameter for each of these quantities. You might want to make it slightly more interesting by introducing another parameter which enables you to have storms which don't all have the same temporal structure. So some storms can be more spread out and other ones more compact. Okay, so number of parameters. What do you then do? You fit the models. You can get to fit the models, you can get these properties analytically, the kind of properties you might be interested in characterize the rainfall. You can also measure these properties because you have some data. And you have an objective function in which you have the difference between the analytical property and the observed property, and you square that and you put in some weights. And you do that month by month. So that basically is the model and how it's calibrated. And I thought I put up this slide because Howard might remember seeing this old slide from a thesis which was slightly too long in 1992, which he had to read. So this is for 3 airports in the UK, and you can see that some of the parameters, I didn't go to the details of the parameters, but this is the storm arrival rate. some of the parameters have a shape that is sort of what you'd expect in the UK. And the cell intensity, also the kind of thing you would expect with some higher intensities in summer. So some of those parameters are easily identified, but others not. So there are, apart from the problems I mentioned earlier on, which was the problem of extremes, the problem of addressing climate change, there's the problem of parameter identification. You've got these three issues here. Now, in a series of research grants that, where Howard was instrumental in coordinating the whole thing and getting the funding and being very successful at doing this over the period 1998 and 2006, in collaboration with University College. So, in particular, I mentioned here Valerie Isham, University College, but also Richard Chandler, who, as he said, started off as a postdoc, but eventually then became a collaborator. Paul Northrop, who was one of the specialists of spatial rainfall. What was nice about this, this collaboration, and I think personally it's always, I have excellent memories of this, is that Howard is also very good at attracting interesting people, experts in their field, such as David Cox, Ignacio Rodriguez-Iturbe. I see he was supposed to come, but he couldn't make it, I guess. Dimitris Koutsianis from the National Technical University of Athens, and some people from CH Wallingford to create a really nice group where had some excellent brainstorming, but Howard was always there to keep us on the straight and narrow so that we didn't stray too much. So good brainstorming, but always focused at the end. And what came out of that was, well, addressing parameter uncertainty, where Richard did some very interesting work there in defining the basically giving multivariate distributions for the parameters. Integrating climate model information, well, that was partially addressed in the sense that, as you just heard, you've got GLMs that do that. These GLMs we then combined with Poisson cluster models in a sort of downscaling mode to obtain some hourly rainfall. That sort of partially addresses the challenge of climate change, not completely, because your downscaling model, it's not clear how you're going to change it when you move into the future. There's quite a legacy from this. There's a piece of freeware hiatus that is held at the Technical University of Athens, which is very popular. That's freeware. Then there's some commercial software. Yes, we have to do that sometimes. So there's a new version of this that I've just been working on with HR Wallingford, which involves a Poisson cluster model with a cascade downscaling process to go down to sub-hourly timescales. So we did quite a lot, I think, in this research project. Let's just mention other things that happen in parallel, other groups, or later. So you'd see, I don't want to go into detail here, but you'll just see that there are some familiar names from this initial collaboration with UCL. So the collaboration with UCL continues. Also, we have now some people who were originally competitors, I suppose, like Paul Kaptweet, who is loosely now linked to the department. He's got an honorary position, Pirul, yeah. And we've got some new people, new kids on the block. Pascalis, who's joined the department, who's an expert in stochastic modeling, who's also been using that kind of model. So there is definitely a legacy here. In terms of the content, some of the things worth mentioning is, so there are some issues of detail, but I think the combination with another type of model, I think that's probably very useful. And up here, the introduction of a third layer of clustering. Right? So second layer of clustering. So in a sense, you have cells, storms, and below the cells, you have something finer if you want to generate fine-scale rainfall. So maybe the message from that is maybe that these models on their own are probably not going to be enough to do the job. However, there are still problems which remain. How much time have I got? Not much, good. He's looking calm, so that's good. But this might seem like a slightly theoretical issue, the issue of reproducing the variance function. It's interesting work done by Morani in around about 2010, which pointed out that these models do not have long-range dependence. So when you look at the variance of the rainfall process at increasing scales, and we're talking about going into scales here, this is in hours, so several days here, you find that the models typically have less variability than the data. So this connected with the Hurst exponent, h, which would be basically omega over 2, which is larger than 0.5, and it's generally indicative of something like infinite memory. That the models don't do. Problems in reproducing extremes have been mentioned by Richard, typically underestimation at the hourly time scale. You see the data as the thick line, but also overestimation at the daily time scales, not quite getting it right. And then climate dependence, well, Richard mentioned UK CP09, which is a single site generator that's available, you can access. It uses, and this is not a strong criticism, I've used it myself, very simple sort of scaling relationships that are supposed to hold in the future, but really have absolutely no basis in anything physical. So I think these are problems that need to be addressed. Some of these problems are being addressed by current work. So I mentioned here work by Kim et al. So what Kim is doing is saying, well, since we can't reproduce this large-scale variability, maybe we need another model. And what we can have is a model on the kind of statistics for every month that we need to calibrate these models that we're looking at here. And the monthly statistics are actually quite well behaved. You can see this is obviously an evidence of some kind of scaling, things like the standard deviation at a number of time scales here. They scale against one another, 32 hours against 16 hours, and standard deviation against the mean. So you can identify a few more or less independent variables characterizing each month, and you can put on something like a SARMA model, so a seasonal ARMA model, on those quantities. And with that, when you put that together with a Poisson cluster model, you manage to reproduce pretty much the variance at higher scales. It has to be said that there's one thing it isn't is particularly elegant. So it's not parsimonious at all. Could definitely do with a bit of shaving from Occam's razor here. And then there's also a question about the Markov structure. Is that going to be sufficient? Other approach, I think, which probably addresses the three problems we're looking at, is to say, well, when we do the fitting, we're fitting on a monthly basis. And when we fit, say, for the month of March, we look at the past months of March. But actually, is there any reason for doing that? Should we not be looking, if we're going to fit to data from this March, should we not be looking at past months that are in some sense similar because, for instance, they had similar mean temperature? And you can do that in two ways. You can define sort of classes of temperatures. You can say any month in the historical data that has temperature within plus or minus 3 degrees of this particular month of March is good. I'm going to use that. Or you can literally use all the data and simply have a weight that decreases depending on how the temperature of that month relates to the current temperature. So that's the Kashmarska approach down here, using a sort of Gaussian shape to define. So if the temperature is very different, then you're going to have weights which are much smaller. Just from the Kashmarska paper, you can see you end up then with parameters as a function of temperature, which is interesting as a result. And what you also get, which I think is very useful, is that instead of the standard simulations, which would be that will be the traditional Poisson cluster model, and the data being here, we now have a lot of non-stationarity here. We can follow a bit introduce more variability in that way. So I think that's really interesting way of introducing dependence on on such variables as the temperature. And obviously for the future, if we want to run this for the future, we take the temperature or any other variable from a regional climate model. So I think that there are a lot of tools around for having an effective stochastic generator for fine-scale rainfall in a changing climate. Probably more comparison exercises are needed. I mean, I'm aware that there are some big comparison exercises that have been carried out, in particular by Moran, as that Richard mentioned. But I think still there are some issues of comparing some of these different approaches. I think on the whole we're going to need to combine generators because one model is not going to do all the scales. So it could be an extra layer clustering, could be combining it with another model such as a GLM. I didn't mention the spatiotemporal because I just wanted to focus on the point problem. The spatiotemporal has these problems plus other ones, such as representing advection, and also the fact that often when we look at a radar picture, it seems that what we're looking at is not spatially stationary. And finally, I think one point here, talking more these days to practitioners, I'm still quite astounded by the fact that there is not enough. Well, there is an understanding that stochastic models are very useful, but a lot of consultants still think, and I'm talking more here about the urban hydrological area, still think that it's not practical to use them because they have very clunky hydraulic models. Right? Now, if you're working in rural hydrology, you may have some nice little conceptual models you can run easily. If you work in urban hydrology, you have a very complex hydraulic model. If I come along with my stochastic model and I say, can you just generate 10,000 years of levels and stream and flows in your system, they're going to fall off their chair. So to avoid that kind of thing happening, you don't say that. What they want is for you to sort of isolate the significant, can you give me some representative simulations? And that, of course, is quite a tricky issue. Part of the problem is first of all, there is computational limitations, I think, but also a lack of awareness of the impact of rainfall variability. There's not enough, there are big designs that are carried out in urban hydrology, which, there are millions of pounds of investment, but you still have consultants who are getting involved in that, and it's sort of strange, I think, to think that they can come up as well, they had to bid, so they had to get the project, so obviously they couldn't be too expensive, and as a result, they don't have the computers available to do this kind of ensemble simulation that would be ideal. I mentioned at the beginning that there was probably not many nice pictures in there. I had to finish with a nice picture, at least a silly picture. So there we are. This is an earlier version of Howard. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Christian. Please stay up, and we have time for some quick questions. Yes, Simon.
Chris, thank you for the talk. Most of these approaches that you presented rely on trying to reproduce some statistic like mean, variance, skewness, or so. How about other approaches that reproduce the whole distribution and the whole correlation structure? And what does these approaches have to offer more? I'm sorry to... No, I'm talking about a new framework that depends on...
I suppose with these models, what you get easily in an analytic form is these kind of statistics. We can't get the whole distribution. Obviously, you could numerically approximate the whole distribution. But so I suppose we go up to the skewness, which is not bad. So, I didn't mention the skewness there probably, but, you include the skewness. So obviously, we could include higher order moments, but so I suppose we've got quite a lot of characteristics of the distribution, but not the whole distribution in a sense. Yeah.
Actually, we can preserve the whole distribution. There are methodologies that we can reproduce the whole distribution and the whole correlation structure.
There might be other approaches then, obviously,
yes,
than this one. Yeah.
It's based on the approach that there is a underlying Gaussian process that when we transform it, we end up with the distribution we want and the correlation structure we want. So essentially, we are able to preserve everything.
Well, hopefully, so this is work you're going to do now with Howard, so that's good news. I knew he was going to ask me a difficult question.
Actually, it's published. It's called the Unified Theory for Stochastic Modeling of Hydroclimatic Processes.
Thank you. It's a great question. Others, please. Roy.
I'm an atmospheric scientist, so I'm not sure if I'm going to ask this question correctly, but you talked about clustering of cells, and I was just wondering, have you been looking at clustering in different regions of the world? For instance, tropical cells are very different than in the UK.
Okay, so that's a good question because it brings up the issue how physical these cells are. Because as you saw, when we do the fitting, in a sense, we put these equations into a big objective function and turn the handle, and you get some, you minimize this thing, highly nonlinear function, and you get some parameters, and they look reasonable. But of course, we haven't really looked into whether the cells we identify. Well, that's not strictly speaking true. I suppose for the spatiotemporal model that is based on this, so there has been some investigation as to whether the cells seem to correspond a bit to the kind of thing the meteorologists are talking about. But it's not, I think they're more conceptual cells. I think so. I wouldn't stick my neck out too much. However, we have looked at data across the world, and certainly, particularly in Australia, there's been quite a lot of work on this, and the model was adapted to sort of Australian context. So there were some changes made. So that, but the structure was still the same idea of cells within storms. But yes, so I think the important thing is here is how physical are these cells? And so,
Yeah, I'm thinking in the U.S. we have these supercells, which are just one cell, and there really isn't
Right.
much of a combination of cells. But they produce typically the highest rainfall rate, so obviously those you want to
that's
pay
actually-
attention to.
So I mean, there is some mileage also in looking into importing some kind of physical information. If we had that kind of physical information about cells into the way we fit the model. That's right, that could be interesting. But it's not easy to identify. Well, the kind of cell you're talking about sounds quite easy to identify. You can probably just actually see it. I've been doing some work, this is another area of interest in sort of rainfall forecasting, looking at radars and just trying to track a cell from one radar picture to the next, which is 5 minutes later. It's actually quite tricky because, so you see cells, you see structures, and you can have very simple algorithms that will identify a cell. But then 5 minutes later, well, it may be clear where that cell has moved to, because everything's moving nicely, but it could have become two cells. Or is that second cell, where does it come from? So tracking cells is quite a tricky issue.
So that's an area that NCAR has spent a lot of time on,
Aha.
30 years. So we're happy to provide you with some of the data. There's a tracking program called Titan, and it's used worldwide. It
Okay,
does
well,
exactly that kind of thing, trying to figure out should a cell be combined, does it
Yeah.
split, does it come together, et cetera.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Yes, useful.
Thank you. I've got a question. Non-stationarity, and particularly with respect to the scaling properties of precipitation. How might we best incorporate that as we start to look to future climates that will develop?
So I think one way is that the penultimate slide there, where you're looking at, in a sense, you're getting the non-stationarity because you're conditioning your model on some non-stationary variables like temperature. And it could be more. I mean, I just indicated using one variable, but you could have temperature, humidity, sea level pressure. So I think you get the non-stationarity by conditioning on what the climate models tell you, or what's for current climate, what reanalysis data would give you. So you get the non-stationarity from these variables, and that would then lead to some non-stationarity for the rainfall, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? And or also other general discussion questions on statistical hydrology at this time. The Canadian Prairie region in particular is a place of extreme rainfall and snowfall events, and we often argue it's all about the tails here, things like that. And so there's great interest in this, and also with respect to rapidly changing rainfall patterns. It's something we're paying much more attention to.
I've never looked at Canadian data, so it could be, there you go.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Howard.
Well, I was just going to say that Christian touched on the issue of practice, and it's still the case that people use these crazy design storm profiles for a wide range of design purposes for which they're totally unsuited. So I think the methodology that's presented here really needs to get into practice so we can do a better job, particularly urban design, but also the broader hydrological design issues too. The structure of the temporal profile of storms is really important.
No, we have issues where Saskatchewan highways design for culverts are based on rational method with probable maximum precipitation, and it's not suitable. So.
No, and of course, I'm only talking about the point aspect, but spatially, additionally, these numbers I assume it's a blanket rainfall, which is also completely unrealistic. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.